Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Sandala. I am Programming and Outreach Specialist here at Library Lake, New Jersey. I am so thrilled to welcome you to this final author event in our summer book bash. I've been on a horror kick lately, and these books are some of my personal favorites. Stephen Graham Jones is the best-selling author of several books, including The Only Good Indians and My Heart is a Chainsaw, as well as the upcoming Don't Fear the Reaper, the sequel to My Heart is a Chainsaw. I am very excited for the sequel, by the way. Brady Hendricks is the best-selling author of several books, including The Final Girl Support Group, which many of us here are fans of, as well as another favorite, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. I see people nodding already, so we all agree. He is also the author of the upcoming How to Sell a Haunted House, which I'm personally looking forward to. Kelly McWilliams is the author of Agnes at the End of the World, which was a finalist for the Golden Kite Award, and Mirror Girls, a Junior Library Guild Gold Standard Selection and Target Book Club pick. I recently read both of these, and they're great, and I highly recommend them. Please check them out. Aliza Layne is a cartoonist, illustrator, and storyteller. She is a creator of Demon Street, a long-form fantasy webcomic for all ages. Beetle and the Hollowbones is her first graphic novel and a Stonewall Honor book. I love this book. I've been gifting it to friends, and I encourage you all to read it. Moderator Becky Spratford, a longtime friend, is also a librarian and a Jersey native, now living in Illinois. She runs a critically acclaimed RA training blog, RA for All. Known for her horror column for Library Journal, Becky is also the author of the Reader's Advisory Guide to Horror, which I highly recommend, 3rd edition. She is a proud member of the Horror Writers Association and serves as their secretary and organizer of their annual Librarians Day. And Becky, take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I realize you've had this author book bash all summer, so we're really happy to be a part of it. One of the reasons we were asked to be here, not just is because horror is so great, but because as part of the Horror Writers Association, I run a program, a national reading program called Summer Scares. And I want to spend a moment because I've invited Grady here, because not only does he live in New York, very close to all of you, but Grady helped us birth Summer Scares. So I'll set the stage, and maybe Grady, maybe you want to talk about your idea, because I think the way you talked about it was so great. We were sitting on the deck of the Queen Mary a bunch of years ago. It's also when I met Stephen on the Queen Mary. And Grady was like, we should have book suggestions for librarians. So you want to talk a little bit about your initial idea, Grady?
Yeah, well, it's funny, like summer's always the time, and I appreciate the nod as the doula for Summer Scares here. Yeah, summer is the time of reading lists, right? It's when you get your class assignments, and it's something I always liked because I was a nerd and like reading was the only thing I was good at school. And so, I always thought like people are always asking at events, or anyone who writes horror, you get asked a lot, especially by librarians, what should they be recommending? Because I think there's sort of this needle in the haystack element to it, like, and you want to hook readers up with books they're going to like, and frankly, no one has time to read it all. And so I can't remember what the event was we were at, and I was just like, why aren't we doing a guide or some kind of guideline for librarians for and I think Becky, you were the one who said we would need to break it down by adult and middle grade and YA, and that was it. It wasn't even that complex of a thought. It was just, I couldn't believe we weren't already doing it, because I feel like, every kid who's out of school over the summer, like if I was a kid now, I'd just play video games all summer. So being able to recommend, werewolf books and ghost books and horror books, it's just keeps those kids on the streets and getting into trouble.
And what I loved about this was, Grady, you're absolutely right. I should have, we didn't think of this, the library people. Sometimes it takes, I think this is important for this library audience to hear, somebody from a slightly outside to say, hey, why aren't we doing this? And Grady really was instrumental in helping us do this, because he agreed to serve as our spokesperson the first year. And he was willing to get the word out and write things and talk to us about it and talk to librarians about it and be out there, going into libraries. And so what we did was, all those years ago, we're actually in year 4. So I think we began in 2019, and we've kept this model. So we have a spokesperson. Grady was our first spokesperson. Stephen was our second, Sylvia Moreno Garcia our third, and Alma Katsu our fourth. We have picked but have not announced our fifth yet, but I'm going to give you a huge hint. This is a person who you know and who writes all age levels of horror. So we're really excited to have this person with us. But the idea is what Grady said, we're going to do a vetted list by librarians. So what we're going to present to you today is I'm going to introduce you to these authors, but I want you to know about Summer Scares. So it is a program where in February, we announce titles for the year. So 3 adult, 3 middle grade, and 3 YA. So I've invited today Stephen, who served as both an author and a spokesperson. His Mongrels was one of our first books. Grady, who was our original spokesperson, and 2 of our current Summer Scares authors, Kelly McWilliams and Aliza Layne, here today. And I just have to tell you, first of all, I've already worked with Kelly a few times, but Eliza, I have not said this to you. I am so proud that we got a Stonewall Honor Book in the middle grade level. We had not had queer representation at the middle grade level. And that is really important for you to understand. We go out of our way to make sure that our picks are diverse in every sense of the word, both in the representation of the authors, but in the types of horror we give. So while Mongrels wasn't super scary that year and super gory, we had a Brian Keene title that year that was, for example. And we do that each year, you know, and we're going to let each person talk about their books and their work with Summer Scares. Because we have a collection of veterans and newcomers here today. And we want to just break this misconception of what horror can be, that it can only be one thing and that it can only be read in the fall, because it can be read all year long and summer's a great time. We do have one quick question before I start with the questions. We want to be notified in February about Summer Scares. Where do we sign up? We are working on that. That's a brand new committee that's starting at the Horror Writers Association. But right now you would follow me on Twitter, or you would follow at Summer Scares. We can maybe put that in the chat, which is our Twitter at Summer Scares. And that's where you can follow it right now. We also have a programming guide. I want to tell all the librarians. And I'll get the link in the chat when people start talking, but it has, from the last 2 years, every book, and the Springfield Greene County Library in Missouri does it. It has every book. It has a summary, read-alikes, book discussion questions, program ideas. And if you have Novelist, you can go on Novelist right now and access a lot of that as well. In the gutter, they have a thing on the main page on the left gutter for Summer Scares. So that's enough about Summer Scares. I would like each person to introduce themselves and their work in general. And I'm going to start with our newcomers. So Eliza, can you introduce yourself to all the librarians and your work in general?
Certainly. So I'm Aliza Layne. I've been a webcomic artist for a bunch of years. My webcomic's been running for like 9 years. And then in 2020, I put out Beetle and the Hollowbones, which is my first middle grade novel. And I wrote Beetle and drew it and painted it mostly by myself with 2 assistants. And so I'm drawing and painting and writing 2 books subsequently from that. So Beetle is a full color fantasy comedy horror graphic novel. And it's about a young goblin whose best friend is a ghost who is cursed to haunt the mall, and the mall sucks so much and they don't want to be there anymore. But they have no choice because Blood Ghost is stuck there. And so the journey is how do we get Blood Ghost out of the mall before the mall gets torn down. And I was fortunate enough this year not only to be a part of Summer Scares, but also to actually talk to kids who had read it for the first time in person, which I had never gotten to do because of like before COVID, I was doing a webcomic, and so all of my feedback was online. And then after my book came out, I didn't get to tour, so I got to meet kids actually for the first time this summer, which was just fantastic. It was so special to have kids come up and talk to me, and they seem to really like it, which is is a huge get. That's the best review I can get. So Beetle's a super special book to me, and I'm really, really happy to be working on 2 sequels for it.
Thank you, Eliza. And that's a great point. We pick books that the readers love, And I didn't mention this before we get to Kelly, we do have subject experts on the Summer Scares Committee. We always have the celebrity spokesperson. So this year, Alma Katsu did that job, and she had been a Summer Scares author. We have Julius Smith, who's our middle grade expert, who is the editor for middle grade horror at Booklist, who's one of our sponsors. We have Kelly Jensen, who's an editor at Book Riot, who's also a sponsor, who's a YA horror expert. And then we have Carolyn Chesla, who runs our Twitter and is a academic librarian who specializes in teen and adult, and then myself and Conrad Stump, who co-chair it. So we do have experts who are vetting these titles for their readability. And I know my school library where I volunteer bought 2 copies of Beetle and Hollowbones, and they aren't staying on the shelf. So
That's so nice to hear.
Kelly, it's your turn to talk about yourself, introduce yourself and your work in general.
Yeah, so I'm Kelly McWilliams, and my first book was Agnes at the End of the World. It's a cult zombie pandemic mashup that came out in June 2020. And my book that's out this year is called Mirror Girls, and it's set in Jim Crow, Georgia. It's the story of biracial twin sisters, one of whom is light enough to pass for white, and the other of whom is obviously Black, who are separated at birth after the murder of their parents. My light-skinned sister Magnolia is raised as if she were white on an old plantation in Georgia, and my other sister Charlie becomes a civil rights activist in Harlem, and they have to reunite and sort of confront the ghosts of their past. So we have historical ghosts, cults, and zombies. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, Grady, your turn. And then we'll let you.
Yeah, and actually, can I just say something quickly that you were just talking about? Yeah, that is one of the things that I didn't realize was so important, is to have an expert in each of the reading levels. You know, middle grade and YA and adult are such different worlds from each other. And, you know, I blissfully, as an adult reader, you know, YA, I just don't know that much about it. Middle grade is way out of my pay grade. So that was something you really pushed for early on, Becky, that was so important, is to make sure we had people who really knew those categories, because a lot of times the books just don't cross over, you know, in terms of awareness.
And before you talk about yourself, though, let me say that's a good point too, Grady, because I do want to let everyone else know that because of the success of Summer Scares, we are now launching for the first time ever a Bram Stoker Award for Best Middle Grade Novel. And it is actually, I'm the chair, so that we're making sure we have good submissions and we're reaching out. We have so many great submissions already, and it's for books published this year. And I'm just so proud that the work we are doing with Summer Scares has led to that, to having an actual Bram Stoker, because we already have one for teen and of course for adults. As Stephen knows very well, winning all the time, and Grady knows losing to Stephen every year. So it's your turn, Grady. Although you've won before.
I'm Grady Hendricks. I write novels like Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires and Final Girl Support Group and all that. My new book is coming out January 12th, How to Sell a Haunted House, about adult siblings who hate each other, who after their parents die have to deal with the cleaning out and selling and putting on the market the haunted house of their parents, which is haunted by puppets, which is just so disgusting. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Grady. Stephen, it's your turn. Why don't you introduce yourself and your work in general? But you're muted.
I'm Stephen Graham Jones. Write lots of horror. My last book was My Heart is a Chainsaw. Before that, Night of the Mannequins, maybe Memorial Ride, this comic book, and Don't Look at Indians. Oh, and I have this here. Look, somebody made an action figure of Elkhead Woman.
Oh, no way.
I know, it's so cool.
That's so
I
cool.
play with it, but it's the only one I have, you know. No, this program though is so cool, because I always imagine that like, you know, a younger reader might feel kind of I don't know, weird about reading horror, you know, like they I feel like they don't have the approval of the world anyways. But if a librarian gives them a book and says, this is for you, then that's like a shield they can use in on the bus with their parents, at family reunions, wherever they go, you know, with their teachers at school maybe. And that's kind of my dream, you know, is that that some 12, 13, 9-year-old or whatever is going to say, but the librarian gave it to me, you know.
Well, and that's our next question, Stephen, a little bit. So why don't you go first about, do you have any stories to share from the experience of being part of Summer Scares?
Yeah, it was. Well, number one, it was during the pandemic, so it was all Zoom like this. I don't know if it was for Sylvia and Alma as well. I know when I very first came on, where were we, in Detroit or Michigan or somewhere? Was it?
Michigan, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And I knew Grady, of course. I know you from that Stoker Con, and I knew Brian already. I'd never met Daniel Kraus, and I don't think I'd read his books at that point either. It was really cool getting to hang out with people in a different setting. Usually we're at conventions and conferences and festivals. This was different. At conventions and conferences and festivals, there's always the pressure to sell some books, to hawk some wares. But at these events, it's not. It's like free books for everybody, and that's the best kind of event, I think.
Yeah, so Stephen presented at our first ever Librarians Day where we did Summer Scares on a panel. And that is true. We're going to be in Pittsburgh this year. And the Librarians Day always features the Summer Scares authors. And the spokesperson so that you can get their books. But that's true. It is all about the library version of this, right? Talking about books and sharing them. What about you, Kelly? Do you have any Summer Scares stories yet to share?
Well, I loved the StokerCon panel that we did. And what I really liked about Summer Scares is that, like, for me as a YA author, and I think it's the same for middle grade too, we don't often break out into that subgenre. Like, I'm not often a horror writer anywhere I go. A lot of the times I'm there for YA, or I get historical fiction, or for Agnes, science fiction or speculative fiction. So it's like the horror category isn't as much talked about among like writing professionals for young readers, but we do kind of a specific thing. Like, I was talking with someone after, we feel like we're like the witch or the warlock at the campfire who's like, come here, kids, check out something a little different. And so it's just nice to get that recognition in children's work.
That's a great point. I just dropped it into the chat. See, I forget about all we do until you say something. Every year we create free videos at the very least with each author for every age group since the pandemic. So I worked with Kelly on the YA panel. We had myself and the 3 current YA authors, and those are for free on the Horror Writers YouTube channel. We make a playlist for every year so that you can go back and use other authors. Eliza, you mentioned getting to meet some of the kids. Is that your favorite memory so far from this experience?
Absolutely. One thing that I wanted to circle back to that was so funny is that I love the description of like being handed a horror novel by a librarian, and having that like sense of legitimacy from that. I also just having them in libraries is such a get, because I used to work in a bookstore, and in fact it was in a mall, and that's where a lot of the weird mall stuff comes from, because it was an experience of great horror. It was fun, but oh my gosh, retail. And so the experience of having parents come in and knowing what parents are doing in bookstores makes me really want libraries to have as many books as possible, and as much access and as much knowledge as possible, because parents are coming in and going, my son can't read stories about girls. My kids can't read anything scary because they might bother me. And their kids want it so bad. And they're like coming up and looking at you, like this, like they're coming up and looking at you and going, I want to read something scary. I want something scary, and I want it to be about mice. And like, the thing that's so breakout about libraries is that kids can go in and sit down for 2 hours, and if it's my book, if it's a graphic novel, they can read it in 2 hours. And it can slip right by. No one knows that you read it. No one can see you, which I think is mega ultra special. And that's something that really thrilled me about being a part of this, is that it's going to be sitting up in libraries and kids are going to be grabbing it and sneaking off into a corner and reading it.
I love that too, because we always make sure we pick at least one graphic novel also for those readers who read more visually. And this year we were able to get a graphic novel into the adult category, which we hadn't done yet, which is My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emile Ferris. And the thing I love about that book, when we talk about picking a range of titles, the committee picked that book because of this world we're living through, because it is all about how horror can be sort of a salve or a salvation from, a way to hide from the real horrors in the world. And that's the entire like thesis of that book. And it's absolutely gorgeous and stunning. So we do try to get a nice range. So that's good. Grady, you already talked about summer scares and your experience with it. So I want to move to the next question and start with you. And I know you're good at this because of Paperbacks from Hell. Talk about why horror is awesome.
Well, it's funny, right? Like I feel like it's around us a lot more than we realize. I was talking to someone a couple of days ago and realized that like all my early exposure to horror was through Disney, the Headless Horseman and the Halloween special, the movie about leprechauns they made with Sean Connery in the 50s called Darby O'Gill and the Little People, which like has this banshee appear at the end, and you watch it at a children's birthday party and like wet your pants basically. And the Haunted Mansion. So much of that exposure as a kid, and I never really realized how much of that came through these channels. And so to me, it's kind of all around us. It's hard to separate it out. But I also feel like one thing that's really nice about horror is that, listen, I love science fiction, I like fantasy, but science fiction is often set somewhere else, another planet, another dimension. Fantasy is often, a second world kind of thing. But horror takes place here in this world. It's contemporary. And as a kid, I remember, if I wanted to read books that were set in the world we live in, they were pretty boring. But horror isn't, because it's awesome and it's full of zombies and vampires and werewolves and all this stuff. And it's set in this world, the world outside. And, it's about more human, a lot of times genre fiction's about big ideas, and horror is usually about human relationships. And so for me, kids who they don't want to go and read something set too far from home. They want to read something set in something that looks like home. And they don't want it to be boring. Horror is the neighborhood they wind up moving into. So that to me is one of the big recommendations horror has going for it.
And before I call on someone else, I do want to do a big shout out to Grady because, Paperbacks from Hell did win the Stoker Award for Best Nonfiction. I was so proud to give it to you on stage. I was so excited. But I will say that your presentations for libraries, and I've seen a few of them. I just saw the new the Final Girl one, which was fantastic. And Grady will come to your library if you contact, and I'm going to give this email out a few times if someone can type it in, Darby or Stephanie, libraries@horror.org. If you want to get any of the Summer Scares authors to come to you, we will ask that you go through us, because this is a service that these authors have agreed to appear virtually for free for you. I know Grady, though, is local to you and has already told me he's willing to travel to New Jersey libraries. But what I love about Grady's presentations are he comes as an author, but he has something that talks about horror and the history of it and why it's there and why it's important and makes it fun. I mean, we did a lot of Final Girls and serial killers, and we were laughing. So he does take his time and really gets that joy of horror out to people. Kelly, what about you? Why is horror awesome now that you have 2 books under your belt?
I love horror, especially right now, because I think it's a good way to be able to talk about things like in our culture that we've like halfway but not quite buried, like things that we really need to sort of like reckon with. Like I tend to set stories sort of on these old plantations where we feel a lot of discomfort. And I think it's a way that people can sort of get buckled in to the idea of going on this ride that sort of will be safe, but may or may not be comfortable. I think it allows us to sort of like look head on at these things in a really new and different way. And what I personally love about horror too is that it creates a kind of intimacy with the readers, where it's almost like a sense of physical touch. Like when you feel that dread sort of gumming up your spine, or the tingles on the top of your scalp. Like I just feel like it's such a powerful way to like reach through and really kind of grab someone. And I think that that's what resonated with me about reading horror as a kid. And to this day, I sort of like being the architect of that on the other side. And that combination of kind of like, things might be uncomfortable. We might look at and talk about the things that we would rather not. And doing it so up close and personal, it can create such a powerful effect. And it just kind of opens up new worlds and new ways of thinking for people too.
And also, Kelly, I know when I talked to you last time, we talked about a story about you going to do research with your mother. I really like that story. You want to talk about that in Tulsa?
Oh, sure. This story,
I think that shows why horror is good too for this stuff.
this story has like multiple layers of horror. It's actually, so my mother is a writer, and she's a Black writer. She's, you know, been working for decades and decades. And her second book was called Magic City, and it was about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And she always used to take me on her research trips with her. So in elementary school, you know, we went and we looked at all these terrifying documents, you know, about what had happened. And we also saw the Klan walk by the State House while we were doing some of our research. And she sort of pointed at them and like, she kind of chuckled to me. And I think horror is kind of like a sister or like a cousin of comedy. And so there was a way in which, like, by laughing and by telling a joke, she was like putting it into perspective. And then the story that she wrote, which has these sort of horror elements, did the exact same thing. It was saying, like, let's be able to look at this and not lose our minds. And the other layer of horror that's kind of on top of that I'm happy to be talking about now is that in the 90s, she couldn't get anyone to review that book. She couldn't get anyone to talk about that book. The publisher sort of essentially buried it. But it's been reissued now, because now we've had sort of Watchmen come through and like dramatize the race riot. We're ready to have these sort of more truthful conversations. And I just like telling that story because it's the horror of things that were buried and kept quiet, and how we dig them up and bring them alive through stories, and how eventually, hopefully, even when the culture is not ready for it, it will catch up. And you can track that through our literature, which I think is really neat.
And I love that story about how it inspired you to write the books you write, which you alluded to at the beginning of your conversation, which was great. Eliza, but what about you? Why do you think horror's awesome?
Let's see. Horror's nasty and sick and twisted and evil, which is what kids want to experience more than anything in the world. And the other thing that's so good about it, I'm gonna kind of tell on myself a little bit. I'm gonna spoil book 2 a little bit.
We'd love it.
I had a really interesting response from several readers with Beetle 1, which has like horror elements, but is like a super light, like funny story. Whereas it's funny, Demon Street, which is not finished, which is my webcomic, is a much more horror focused thing. And I want to write horror for adults later on. But the thing that like really, one of the things that really struck me is that readers would come to me after and go, I'm really happy to see that your lesbian characters are living in a world with no problems. And what I've often wanted to respond with, and I haven't had that conversation in person, which is where I'd feel like good, you know, having that like dialogue back and forth, because sometimes these are emails or like comments on Goodreads. I'm not doing that. I'm not going to go Goodreads and talk.
Good choice.
I'm not doing that. But like people will say like, it's so nice that your lesbian characters live in a world with no problems and their relationship is uncomplicated and everybody is cool with it. And my response is, oh my God, really? How do you know that? You, boy, did you make that up in your own mind. I'm so happy that you like it, but that's not going to continue to be true. And I think what's really fun about continuing the story, like, you know, post kiss, is that I do get to kind of get in there. And I'm so excited to see what the response to that is going to be, because I think it will make people pretty uncomfortable, which is an interesting thing to be looking ahead into, like going forward with a series. I think that's a really interesting thing to be like sailing towards, because book 2 is already written and I'm drawing it now. So it's like this other part of the process where I'm like doing a huge amount of the writing as I'm like drawing through. And like, as I'm adding like more and more and more and more layers of discomfort to it, I'm like, what are people going to, who already know these characters, like, what are they going to think of this? And the really delicious part of it is going, ooh, I can't wait to find out. Like, I'm not like afraid of it. I'm just like, oh, this is going to be so fun. And then like, did anybody watch, by the way, I know people are having a discussion in the comments about like scary kids movies. I think for me, mine was the animated Hobbit movie
Oh,
The
there you
like,
go.
oh, who animated that? Does anybody know?
No, but I love
Was it like
that.
Rankin Bass? It was somebody weird. It was
It
a
was.
weird studio.
We'll have one of the
And it was like
librarians
very
look it up.
knobbly and everything. Yeah, it was like a really knobbly, a lot of movies, like, I feel like we don't have like really like gross, like knobbly children's movies anymore. Like Land Before Time looked like that. And then the animated Hobbit movie looked like that, where the characters were like just ghastly looking. And it was really great. I loved it. And so that's like a you know what, that's a really fun thing about visual horror too, is like the ability to see like a variety of different bodies of like heroes, of people who just look bizarre. That's like a visual component to it that exists in graphic novels maybe a little bit more. That
I like that how you're
like to
adding
get
that
into.
visual element into our
Yeah.
talk. So that's really helpful. Stephen, what about you? I know you have great answers for this. Why is horror so awesome?
Man, if I'd have gone first, I'd have great answers. If everybody else's answers were so good, I just want to say yes. But you know, I think of like horror like a haunted house. We love to go to those haunted house attractions. We love to be ushered through all those rooms and have the spring-loaded zombie jump out at us and the fog machine and get lost in the darkness and all that. And I think that's a big part of what people like about horror. But also, what horror has that a lot of genres don't have is the stakes are immediately really high, like in fantasy, science fiction, literary, crime, whatever. Well, maybe not crime, but you have to do this little arc to establish that the world is in danger or the family's in danger or whatever it is. In horror, you show somebody getting decapitated on page 1, the stakes are high right there, and it's really, really nice. I like that it just hits the ground running. I also like about horror that we, the reader, like when I read a science fiction novel, I'm kind of signing a contract that I want to feel the awe and the vastness of, you know, creation or the world, the universe, all that. When I sign on to a fantasy novel, then after I'm done reading it, maybe I want to put on a pillowcase and make a sword from cardboard and go fight my friends in the front yard. You know, at 50 years old, they'll look good, I think. And but with horror, you don't go in saying, yes, I want this book to reprogram me. I want this book to make me leave the lights on at night. You go into a horror novel looking for the zipper on the monster's costume. And in prose fiction, that's, you know, a poorly delivered line or a badly staged chapter ending, you know, all those kind of zippers we can see. We might see a few of those, and we close the book and we think, well, that didn't get to me. I saw the zippers. But then 3 o'clock in the morning, you realize that book has laid some eggs in your head and they're starting to hatch, you know. And I like that horror can make a reader, make a person change their behavior, if that makes sense. And also, this is how to tell the story. You know, back in, this would have been 85, 86, I guess. I was going to school outside Wimberley, Texas, and there was like a hidden place behind the gym where everybody kind of met to exchange money and illicit goods and stuff, you know. And I went back there once, and this guy reached down the front of his pants, just like John Bender in The Breakfast Club, you know. I thought he was getting his stash out and he's going to make me carry it for the rest of the day. And he said, here. And he didn't pull out drugs. He pulled out a Queen Greatest Hits cassette and he slipped it to me. And he said, don't let anybody see you with this. You will get beat up every day if they see you with this. And I loved that feeling of having an illicit good, you know. And I had that same feeling in 2006 when a horror reviewer friend called me up and she said, hey, can I send you a book? And I said, always, but why? Why don't you want it? And she said, I just read it and I do not want this book in my house anymore. And it was Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door. And I got that same feeling that this is something that's too hot to hold, you know? And so of course I want to try to hold it. I think that's the way we kind of tend to be with horror and whatever media, you know. We're afraid that we're not gonna be able to see the zippers, but we forge in anyways and we leave the lights on, you know.
I love that, Stephen, because that helps with the library workers too. What everyone said is, some of them might not like horror themselves, but we want to give it out to the patrons who want it. And I have a story with an actual patron who did this once. They brought back a horror book. It was The Exorcist in a plastic bag, in a Ziploc bag. And when it came to the check-in desk, we said, oh, is it damaged? They said, no, I read it. I loved it, but I had to bury it in the backyard because I couldn't have it in my house and I didn't have time to return it. But I didn't want it to be damaged. And I love that story. Yes, put it in the freezer. We did give the person that advice, but they said they tried that and then they went to get ice cream and they scared themselves. So we were just thankful that the person brought it back. But that is part of the thrill of why people love it. So now I want to switch it a tiny bit and change this question a little bit, because this is why it's awesome, right? But I argue all the time that we need horror, that it is important in our world. So I'm going to start with you, Kelly. I would like you to talk about, and I think you actually started to talk about this a little, so you're a good place to start here. Why do readers of all ages need horror? And if you'd like to focus on the age you write for, I think that would be really helpful. So you first, Kelly.
I think we talked a little bit on our YA panel that there's nothing scarier than being a teenager. And one of the things that we do is, like human beings with these brains that think and plan, is we like to try and imagine, what's the worst that could happen. And I always found, when I was a kid reading, it was almost like comfort food. It would be like I'd have like my Stephen King novel, and it just felt like a big bowl of mac and cheese, because whatever was going wrong with my life, it couldn't go that wrong. And so there was almost like a guardrail that it put up. And then it also allowed me to sort of spin out and imagine like all of these different possibilities, and to try and feel like I had that control where I could see it coming. Like we just bought a house, and so suddenly those haunted house novels are really hitting deep, because you just don't know what to expect, and you're trying to imagine it, and you're trying to get out ahead of it. And I think horror has especially met a need right now for people in marginalized communities. Like I said before, it's like it gives us a language to talk about things that I think sometimes people feel like I'm lecturing them. If I just talk about things in a contemporary way, or if I write an essay, but it's like, well, let me tell you this story about this ghost. I can sometimes get to talking about things that people will feel like they're participating in it. They're participating in the imaginative exercise of being a marginalized person, or having, this air soaked with a history that you can't escape. They're part of it with me. Like I'm writing them in as the protagonist. And I just think that that's invaluable for building empathy. That listen, the ways that we exist in the world, we're scared by very different things. And so when I'm able to put you in my shoes, or the shoes of like members of my family who have a certain type of experience, and you get to feel that fear, I really think that it opens up your ability to empathize with that group of people, and teaches you a lot about these experiences in a really unique way.
Thank you, Kelly. How about you, Eliza, writing for the middle grade age level, the 8 to 12-year-olds? Why do they need horror?
Horror's so gross, which is why we need it the most. I think the idea of like having a sick fascination with something is something that, as kids are reading, nobody wants to talk about having a sick fascination with things, especially with kids having a sick fascination with things. Kids like squatting down in the dirt and like taking a bug apart. Like that's horrid. That's horrible. Why would any of God's angel children do such a thing? And yet there is this horror element to childhood that goes like largely undiscussed because we grow up and forget. But there's that feeling of like, my friend told me to eat bark and I threw up. I hit my friend on the head with a tree branch and broke her skull, or something hideous that is like nested inside of childhood. I just end up having the most empathy for it. Like I just end up finding it the most delicious thing to think about. And that's something that, as I go further into writing more things and writing different things. But Beetle has a bunch of very specific elements that of like stuff that you would imagine would happen to you at the mall. So the escalator like opens up and it has horrible gnashing teeth and it swallows you and you go down into the guts and then you're stuck in the guts. And there's like catacombs under the mall, and there's like evil, horrible statues, and it's like an ancient crypt. And then when you break the mall open like an egg, there's like a disgusting nest of catacombs underneath. And I think that's really fun. I think that makes going to today's decrepit, falling apart malls so fun. I think it makes you want to open that door that says employees, that you're not supposed to open, and walk and get lost from your mom in the back rooms that smell like garbage. I think those are adventures. I think kids should do terrible things.
I love that idea of horror as an adventure for kids too, because they're already thinking about it. Thank you, Eliza.
Stephen, ghouls. They already want it to be ghouls.
They do. Stephen, so you don't go last this time too. And I know you have things to say about this as well. Why do we need horror in our lives?
I think, I guess I know that we came up on the savannah like for the last 6 million years, evolving. And we were like trading in our claws and our teeth and our speed and our muscles and our camouflage for brains. You know, we were investing in brains instead of all the other defense mechanisms animals have, which meant we were just like a chicken nugget of the savannah. You know, everything could take a bite of us and without much effort. Which is to say, I think fear got programmed into us biologically. It got hardwired in. And in today's world where we sterilize everything and shine lights into all the corners, I think we've lost that sense of teeth in the darkness that are going to consume us. And horror can give that back to us. And when we feel that spike of fear, I think that's when we're the most human, actually. I think the very first stories told around our very first flickering campfires were horror stories. They were about the monster 3 valleys over, and the story was told such that the monster was a lot bigger than it was. But that's the way you do it, you know? But I think horror is the oldest genre, and I think it's the most vital to us as humans, if we want to stay human, you know?
Oh, no, I definitely agree. Whenever you talk about that, I'm always just nodding along. Thank you for sharing that. Grady, you spend a lot of time thinking about this question too, with all your presentations and your nonfiction work as well. Why do we need horror?
Well, you know, books are really good at teaching empathy because they're all interior. You have to read a book from the point of view of a character who's not you. They don't exist. You basically, while you read that book, you rewire your brain to be whoever it is, you know, that's telling the story. And I think really for a long time, but very explicitly with Anne Rice in the 80s and Clive Barker, horror really started going out of its way to share the point of view of monsters, to be sympathetic to them. I mean, you could say Mary Shelley did it with Frankenstein to some extent, but, you know, I mean, he still kills a lot of people. But you know, and now I feel like horror does a really good job of giving the monsters their moment, giving them their point of view. And on the one hand, it's really nice because there's a lot of othering, you know, that goes on in just our daily lives. And I think people who read horror are very used to stepping onto the other side of that line and seeing, you know, oh, those people are supposed to be horrible blood-sucking zombies. Well, I'm used to empathizing and seeing from the point of view of a horrible blood-sucking zombie. But I also think it lets us do something a little trickier, which is like what Stephen said about laying eggs that hatch in your head. One of the things I was so happy to do, and kind of one of the excuses I had for coming to you with summer scares, is I really wanted to get Daniel Krause's Rotters out into more young readers' hands because it is the most antisocial book I've ever read in my life. And the fact that it's marketed towards a YA reader is so nice. It is a book that, you know, like the best punk, rejects everything we're told is good. Cleanliness, kindness, empathy, being polite, respect, everything that we're told always is so wonderful. That book just, you know, mocks relentlessly and treats like radioactive waste. And it was something so refreshing about the way it just threw a brick through a lot of windows. So yeah, horror gives us that monster's point of view and asks us for while we're reading to be the monster.
Thank you, Grady. And yes, Rotters we picked for YA for the first year, also because many of the library workers who've been around long enough, like I have, we were all, those of us who love horror, loved how much love it got from the library awards. But it's older, and that's a good point. I haven't pointed out about summer scares. We pick titles that are 2 to 8 years old when we pick them. We do not want super brand new titles because, you know, as you know, at libraries, the backlist, titles you have, we want to promote. So that is really important. Also, when we get like an example like Kelly, she'll already have another book out, for example, that you can give readers. This year, another YA author is Adam Caesar, right? And he's Clown in the Cornfield. The brand new one, Friendo Lives, is coming out in a few weeks. And when we did Labyrinth Lost by Cordova, we picked it when the series was over, so people could have a whole series. So that's a really good point. There was a question in the chat, which I'm going to answer because it's an easy answer, about book club choices for groups that don't normally read horror. I will tell you two things. One, that's the whole point of Summer Scares. In the programming guide, every book we pick has book discussion questions that are created by Conrad Stump, who is a library worker in Missouri. So the links are there. Stephanie's going to send them out later to the programming guide, but there's also the archive for Summer Scares with other year's programming guides. But any book we've picked makes a good book discussion book. And again, Novelist is a new partner this year. They teamed up with us. I believe most New Jersey libraries have access to Novelist. And they are highlighting it as well and providing, links and letting you know which ones are good for book discussions as well. So that's that answer. We had another question, and I did not think of this one before. So I'm going to ask you really quickly, who wants to answer this? I bet Stephen's answer is no. Do you think about the gore level before you write the books? And some readers don't want a lot of gore. I'm going to let Stephen go first because I'm pretty sure you don't. But you're muted. You're muted.
No, I don't worry about the gore level anyways, but I don't have to either, I'm not gonna get policed or anything, or my wrist isn't gonna get slapped because I got too gross. I have had editors though pull me back before and say, I can see what this is doing in the story, but it almost made me throw up. So can we please cut it? But which is fine. That's the best compliment, and I hate cutting those. Like my girl, she used to have this really gory scene, and the editor told me, we were getting really close to finalizing it, and she said, "Listen, this scene, I can see how it goes, I can see how it fits, but this book is going to find its way into some young adult hands. Do you really want to, lay this on them?" And I said yes, but she talked me out of it. So.
That's a good one. And so we have time to answer everything. Before I ask the rest of you about gore level, the ones who aren't talking, there was another question about podcast recommendations. So if any of the authors have a podcast recommendation, can you type it into the chat while you're not talking? And then Stephanie is going to compile them all for everyone. So Grady, I'm going to ask you about gore level. Do you think about it when you write?
Well, yeah, a lot. But I also think that worries about gore, horror really got tagged with that sort of like gore overkill in the 90s. And it was horror's own fault. And it really is a tag that stuck with the genre. I think most authors who write horror now, they know that it's sort of an arms race. You really can't win. It turns into diminishing returns at a certain point. You really have to apply it judiciously. And on top of that, you get a lot more charge out of setting it up emotionally, so that when something violent happens, it's the emotions that really snap people in the face. You want people to feel it on their body. You want them to feel that arm snap or that skin, get cut. But at the same time, if you're not selling the emotions, that stuff gets old real quick. So I get why people get worried about gore, but you look at something like Anne Rivers Siddon's The House Next Door, which I think has zero gore in it, and is one of the most upsetting books I've read in a long time. And it has a horrible dinner party in it. As a Southerner, I'm appalled to this day. I'm getting faint just thinking about it. So it really is the emotional stuff that hits, and I think most horror authors know that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Grady. I'm going to ask the two that write for minors, because I think this is the thing we get from parents. Oh, it's going to be so gory. And that's not the things that hit with people emotionally. It's not those gory scenes. It's the really emotional, because horror is all about making you feel things, right? And that's what we get all the time. Well, how can you give this if it's gory? And the world is pretty gory too, by the way, the news. I always say to parents when they complain, I'm like, does your kid have a phone? Because if your kid has a phone, do not complain to me about what's coming in the book, because they're seeing unvetted access. So Eliza, what about for the youngest then with the gore?
I haven't really had an issue with this with Beetle. I think, as far as as far as like editorial pushback, I'm always like more worried about gay stuff than I am about horror stuff. Because, you know, there's like, can we make this less adult? Even when it's totally benign. But it's hard because my webcomic has a lot of horror stuff, but it's told in a really like piecemeal way. It's like it's almost diary-ish because I'm not being edited and I'm only doing it when I can. And so in that one, all the kids are drowning in swarms of lizards. So, and that's probably the worst thing that I've written is the part where all of the parts where kids get drowned in swarms of lizards. But like, I mean, they're all alive now. So I don't know. I think the thing that I'm most worried about, as far as like scenes that need to be cut, is probably like emotional stuff. Is probably like the horror of like because something that I like to talk about as like a middle grade author and as like a kids author is the horror of not being taken care of by adults, because it's the most awful thing that can happen to you as a kid. And that's a really uncomfortable subject for a lot of people. And that's something that I'm super interested in writing about. So I'm interested to see how that like flows going forward.
That's a great perspective. I'm going to let Kelly answer too, but I want to say yours is the tamest in our middle grade. I want to point out that we picked a book this year for middle grade, Scary Stories for Young Foxes, which was a Newbery Medal finalist. Okay. That book is scary and a little bit violent. So don't think kids aren't reading it. And that was a Newbery pick. Kelly, what about you? What do you think about gore level when you're writing?
You know, it's funny. I get a lot more pushback from my publisher about the F word than about anything gory. And I think at one point my editor was like, you can have 7 or less, you know, like, but keep it, you know, and then that's like, if you want to do 14.
7, why 7?
I don't know. It's like that biblical cadence. I don't know. But then, you know, 12 and up, they want none of it. But for me, I think a lot of parents and a lot of people are aware that like books are not going to be your big source of gore for your teenagers. Like it's going to be the video games, it's going to be the TVs and movies. What I love is that when I write my gory scenes, you can't see that the blood is fake because it's all fake. So it like can have more of an impact even, I think, than the TV, and they don't give us enough credit for that. But I agree that, you know, you want to use your gore really sparingly just as an artistic and technical thing, because once you use that shock factor, people are braced for the shock. So you want to like make sure that it comes at the right time. And I usually plant one like around that all is lost moment.
I like that. That's a great point too. And I love the different age perspectives and what you worry about in terms of those limiters. So for the last question, I do want to ask, and I want the attendees to answer in the chat. All right. Because we want to have as many book recommendations as possible. But I don't want to let you go without asking you, what recent or upcoming books besides other people here are you excited to read? Also, like, you know, specifically titles you think that maybe the library workers don't know about, and you wish more people knew about. And they can be older titles as well if you'd like, because I know Grady knows a lot of great older titles. So I'm gonna let you go first, Grady. But what do you want people to read? And again, everybody in the chat can also give recommendations as well. So you first, Grady.
Yeah, so one book, you know, one of the things I often see, I see it in my family, and I also hear it from librarians, is getting teenage boys to read. You know, if I'd had Call of Duty or Gears of War or something when I was a teenager, I wouldn't read either. But there's a book coming out. It's a reissue of a book from the 80s from Valancourt called Carnosaur by Harry Adam Knight. And we didn't think we were going to get, I sometimes work with Valancourt and I'm not involved with this reissue. I had tried to be, and we didn't think we could get the rights to Carnosaur, and then they got them. And I got to say, Carnosaur came out years before Jurassic Park, but it is essentially Jurassic Park. But they realized that to make it so much cooler, instead of isolating these dinosaurs on an island somewhere and giving you some wonder shots of them for about 40 minutes before the carnage starts, if they put the dinosaurs in a British suburb and pretty much have dinosaurs turning over trucks by page 5, it is just an out and out dinosaur stomp fest. It is so much fun. It's a fast moving book. If I had been 12 or 13 years old and been handed this thing, I would have been in love with it. So Carnosaur is coming. It is a blast. And then the other thing I wanted to say for librarians, as a nonfiction book, it's a couple of years old now, but a guy named Scott Poole wrote a book called Wasteland. And I'm not a big fan of academic horror books. Sometimes they can be a little dry. And I really am not a fan of World War I because, boring. But this is a book that basically looks at World War I and sort of puts forth the theory that most horror in this century has its roots in World War I. And it sort of really goes over what the war was and then what its sort of children were. And it changed how I look at horror. It changed how I look at history. It changed a lot of stuff. It's not dry at all. It's really, really a phenomenal read. And I can't recommend it enough. If you're a librarian, you want to get a handle on sort of where all this horror came from in the 20th century. So yeah, but also if you have young boy or girl readers, but I just think, it's so hard to find something that clicks with boys, Carnosaur.
I love that suggestion. And the Valancourt books are fantastic. And I have read Wasteland too. It is fantastic. Stephen, you're always having books that you want to tell people to read or that authors, more people should know. What are you pushing right now?
No, I just, we were talking about Daniel Kraus, so I'll mention his book, Whalefall, coming out next year, I believe. Whalefall is amazing. Daniel did so much research on what it's like to be inside a sperm whale. And it's super convincing, super terrifying, just wonderfully, wonderfully told. It's an amazing, amazing novel. And Becky, we were talking about this before the panel started. I would also recommend Gwendolyn Keist's Reluctant Immortals. I think people who come out of like in Austen and the Bronte sisters stuff, I think that this will just really be nice for them, And I think somebody asked in the chat, what's good for a book club that doesn't read horror? And I would say Reluctant Immortals would be a really good entry point. I'm reading a book right now by C.J. Good called Mavefly, Maeve. I think it comes out next summer, and I think I got tricked into reading it because somebody told me it's a slasher. It's not a slasher, but there's a lot of violence and terrible, terrible stuff going on. So I'm loving it.
Thank you. Someone also mentioned Tender is the Flesh in the chat, and that is a great book. That you mentioned Reluctant Immortals. I'm doing one of the book launches with Gwendolyn for that book. You can find online for her virtual book tour. But also, and I'm putting this in the chat now, I have a Horror for Libraries giveaway I do every week. I know I have a copy of Stephen's upcoming book. If I ever get Grady's, I'll have one. Stephen's upcoming book soon, but Gwendolyn's I'm giving away the week it comes out. So if you can, I put it in the chat and Stephanie will pass it on. It's on my horror blog, and you enter once and you're entered going forward. I would also add Daniel Kraus's book that's coming out in October called Wrath, which is, Grady, you will love this. It's mutant rats, basically.
Oh no, I've read it. It's a lot of fun. I have too.
It's great. So I have a lot to say about that. But we only have a lot of time left, so I'm gonna let Eliza and Kelly go. What do you think people should be reading? Any type of books, but it'd be great if it was horror. So Eliza.
For me, my big pick would be a book that I wish would get reprinted. I think it's rare now. It's When I Arrived at the Castle by Emily Carroll. I want to see it again.
She's a former Summer Scares author.
I want everybody to have a copy of it. It's so sexy. It's so scary. It's so good. It has the most delicious drawings. I'm always looking for new stuff from Emily Carroll.
I love it.
She's like my old standby as far as favorites go.
And she is a former Summer Scares author as well. And I suggested another former Summer Scares author, Andy Davidson's The Hollow Kind, which is coming out in October, which blew me away. I gave it a star, or it's coming out tomorrow, the star in book list, actually. And Kelly, the last word, what should people be reading?
I keep recommending Kaylin Barron in YA. She has a book called Cinderella is Dead that is like a fairy tale mashed up with a sort of a zombie vibe. There's some dystopia in there too. But she's also got coming out next year, remixed Jekyll and Hyde. So like she does part of that, remix sort of Black retelling of Black Jekyll and Hyde. And I'm very excited. I think it's really good.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. I like to say, and I'm welcoming you, Kelly and Eliza, once you're in the Summer Scares family, you're always in the Summer Scares family, as Stephen and Grady know. So Thank you all for being here. I appreciate the breadth of experience, both as authors and as part of the Summer Scares. And again, another shout out to Grady for being brave enough to say, hey, we need to do this, and then actually stepping up and helping. So thank you for getting this started. And thank you all. I know Stephanie's going to get the chat out. Thank you for all the suggestions, the recommendations. And again, it's libraries@horror.org. If you ever have a question, you ever want any author to come to your library, we have a whole team of people that work to do that for you. If you're having a big event, and if you're in New Jersey, Grady can come. So we'll talk. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Becky. And thank you, Stephen, Grady, Kelly, Eliza. This was so great. Such a fun conversation. Thank you for being here. It's been amazing. So many good recommendations from all of you. So I'm super excited. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here too, for bearing with us as we went a few minutes over.
Yeah, thanks all. Bye. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.